Riots. They have occurred throughout history for a multitude of reasons by people across the world. They are set off by what the masses, together with passionate beliefs to those concerned, whether they are right or wrong. In this episode, the commotion was caused by the smallest of difference of opinions within the theatrical community, both actors and audience. Was it to be or not to be? That is the question for this vintage scandal of the Astor Place riot. The Macbeth play is beloved by school exam boards throughout the world, as it is an easy way of introducing minds to the works of William Shakespeare. The plot is relatively simple. Good destroys evil, no heavy analysis of long speeches, and a battle at the end which everyone likes. There is one tiny problem. It is perceived in theatrical circles as a cursed play, and many superstitions have arisen over the years, and it is commonly referred to as the Scottish play. A person who utters the word Macbeth in a theatre, who is in the cast, has to leave those present and perform a cleansing ritual. They must turn around 3 times, spitting over their left shoulder, and sometimes recite a line from a popular Shakespearian play, such as The Merchant of Venice or A Midsummer Night's Dream. Only then is the culprit permitted to return to the theatre. The play has been turned into numerous theatrical productions, in Britain and around the world, films, television, and even opera pieces, translated into many languages, and gold miners in the 19th century would quote from it in their leisure time. Harmless fun, you could say. But on the 10th of May 1849, 2 of the leading Shakespearean actors of the day were performing Macbeth in Manhattan theatres, which were within walking distance of each other in New York, and both resulted in 2 different outcomes. One went smoothly, whilst the other ended with a riot, culminating in a fire, 31 people dead, countless injured, and over 100 arrested. As we are dealing with the noble bard, we should reveal the dramatis personae in our story. They are the British classical actor William Macready and the American actor Edwin Forrest. Macready came from a family that were involved in provincial theatre management. He first tread the boards as Romeo in Birmingham in 1816, but really made his name as Richard III. He never looked back after this, and was regarded in later years as the grand old man of theatre. The second one is Edwin Forrest. He was born in Philadelphia in 1808. He did not come from a theatrical background, but was trying to improve himself by being apprenticed to a printer after the death of his father, who was a clerk in a bank. One evening he went to a demonstration of nitrous oxide, better known as laughing gas. He agreed to be part of the demonstration, and instead of laughing, he recited passages from Richard III. His performance impressed a local lawyer called John Swift, who persuaded him to audition at the Walnut Theatre. He was accepted, and started his rise to become the leading American Shakespearean actor of his day. He was a barrel-chested man, and was described as brassy. This contrasted with his great rival Macready, who could be described as a subtle performer. Interestingly, Forrest was earning hundreds of dollars a night, making him the highest earning actor in the world. By contrast, Macready was making around £200. Rates in the US for such performances were much bigger. The United States in the 1840s was somewhat divided. We assume today that there has always been an alliance of some sort between the US and Great Britain. This is completely erroneous. Within living memory, there were still people alive at the time who were born under British rule and remember their families fighting for independence. More importantly, the two countries had fought a war between 1812 and 1814, in which the White House had been burnt to the ground by British troops. Since that date, no actual hostilities broke out between the two countries, but there were constant boundary disputes that required delicate diplomatic negotiations that needed to be resolved. The United States was in an expansive mode, having secured huge areas of Mexican territory in the southwest of the country from a recent war. Yet it was beginning to tear itself apart over the vexed question of slavery. America was also beginning to experience demographic changes as German and Irish citizens began to emigrate to the country. This provoked a backlash from the local population. Nevertheless, both nativists and immigrants were united in their distrust of the British. But not all American society were anti-British. Large sections of the wealthy wished to copy European habits, and there were frequent overseas visitors conducting US tours. These included well-known Victorian figures, such as the novelist Charles Dickens, playwright Oscar Wilde, and the Shakespearian actor William Macready. The latter made successful trips in 1826 and 1843 to 1844. Professional rivalry between leading thespians is probably as old as the birth of theatre in ancient Greece. Provided the American and British actors stayed in their own countries, there was no way of judging their irritation with professional rivals. But things were about to change, as Macready made what would be his last trip to the US and would be appearing in New York giving the Astor Opera House a rendition of Macbeth, whilst his major rival, Edwin Forrest, would be treating his audiences to the same lines down the road at the Bowery Theatre. What could possibly go wrong? So what happened to make the two leading Shakespearean actors fall out? Apart from the occasional trip abroad, neither actor had anything to do with each other. They were never part of the same company or toured together. Occasionally they would both be in the same country, but the reception of the foreigner was generally positive. In September 1836, Forrest made his first trip to Britain. Whilst his performance as Spartacus in The Gladiator at the Drury Lane Theatre was not a success, he made favourable impressions on local audiences with such Shakespearean classics as the lead role in Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. He was welcomed by many famous luminaries of the theatre. He was invited to the famous actors' club The Garrick for dinner. In many ways it was a success. In 1845, Forrest returned to the UK with his new bride. He took up residency at the Princess Theatre, where he attempted to recreate his old roles. During a performance of Macbeth, he was hissed by certain members of the audience, but other people shouted them down. He blamed this slight on supporters of Macready. The latter certainly had supporters in the press, as this comment shows.
A burlesque of the elder Keats' mannerisms, varied by the Yankee nasal twang.
Other publications described his role in Macbeth as comic and Lear as a roaring pantaloon. More importantly, Macready used his influence to prevent Forrest meeting with an English repertory company based in Paris. Consequently, he was reduced to touring small provincial theatres. A revengeful Forrest attended a performance of Hamlet by Macready in Edinburgh, secreting himself in a private box where he could critically observe the performance. When Macready made the speech, "They're coming to the play, I must be idle, get me a place," Forrest jumped onto the stage and waved his handkerchief wildly in the air to demonstrate against what he felt was the ineptitude of the performance he was witnessing. The Scotsman newspaper put it down to pure jealousy, and he lost the sympathy of the British public. His reputation was not helped by a letter to the Times that denied he was ever jealous. On returning to America, Forrest gave a performance of King Lear at the Park Theatre in New York to rapturous applause. This was followed by a public banquet in his honour, in which he made a speech on his recent trip to the British Isles. He was animated by the ungenerous motives towards the really deserving of any other country. It was reported at the time. Obviously, the home crowd were going to take his side, rather than some English actor. There was even talk at the time that he should enter Congress. In September 1848, Macready returned to the US, where he had ideas of abandoning acting and setting up a drama school in either Cambridge or Boston, where he had always been welcome. But it was not to be. In Philadelphia, he was hissed by audiences, and 2 entries in his private diary illustrate his feelings.
Rehearsed with care, but I have brutes to deal with, not intelligence. Ignorance made drunk will well describe American actors from Mr. Forrest downwards.
Later he wrote,
The Baltimore papers characterize the performance of Forrest as equal, if not superior to mine, and speak of him as an artist and a gentleman. Am I to dwell in this country?
It is one thing to use your private diary as a type of psychological comfort blanket. It is another to criticize the leading Shakespearian actor publicly in his own country. Macready's words were certainly tactless.
He did towards me what I am sure no English actor would have done to him. He openly hissed at me.
Forrest replied to these insults by calling Macready a superannuated driveller. The two continued to trade insults, which were gleefully reported in the press. To make matters worse, Forrest chose to mount the same plays as those of Macready in the same city. Before we go on to the events of that dreadful night, we need to examine the ambience of the 2 venues. The Bowery Theatre was initially set up to cater for the upper echelons of New York society, but by the 1830s to the 1840s, it was reduced to producing animal acts, minstrel shows, and melodrama. Under its actor-manager Hamlin, it largely covered American themes. It acquired such unfavourable nicknames as the Slaughterhouse, Bowery Melodrama, or Bowery Actors, as its audience was certainly from the wrong side of the tracks. You had to sit on benches to watch the performance. In contrast, the Astor Opera House was located on Lafayette Street, between Astor Place and East 8th Street. It was designed to appeal to a section of society called the Up-Teens. This was thought to be the most well-to-do people in New York. Instead of benches, patrons, who could only acquire their seat by subscription, would enjoy upholstered seats rather than benches. 500 general admission holders could only view the performance at a place called the Cockpit, down a narrow flight of stairs. Everyone was expected to arrive fresh-shaven, evening dress, and kid gloves. It was designed as a substitute for the general drawing room, a refined attraction which the ill-mannered would not be likely to frequent, and around which the higher classes might gather, for the easier interchange of courtesies, and for that closer view which aids the candidacy of the acquaintance. Obviously, it was not intended to compete for patrons of the Bowery Theatre. However, like all sections of entertainment, it wanted to sell to the elite, but had to substitute opera for theatre to make ends meet. Come the 7th of May 1949, Macready had arrived in New York and was going to give the Up-Teens his version of Macbeth. It was a complete disaster, as rotten eggs, potatoes, shoes and bottles were thrown at him. including upholstered seats. It was reported that the theatre was largely filled of a mob bent on putting down the favourite of what they called the kid-gloved and silk-stocking gentry. The curtain went down, and Macready just wanted to go home on the earliest ship. In the meantime, Forrest was also playing Macbeth to the Bowery Theatre audiences and received rapturous applause, especially when he quoted the lines, "What rhubarb, senna, or what purgative drug will scour these English here?" New York society and the press were deeply concerned that the great actor was subject to unwarranted abuse. What would the Times of London say about this incident? 47 prominent US citizens, including Herman Melville and Washington Irving, wrote to him and asked him to repeat the performance to allay for the abuse he received. And then it all came to a head on the day of the riot. As we all suspect that riots usually have a strong motive, this one was no exception. Seeking to cause embarrassment and stir up the acting controversy, a series of billboards were put around town by the local Democratic Party with the words, "Shall Americans or the English rule this city?" It certainly was a call to arms for the masses. The chief of police reported to the mayor that he did not have enough men to control the situation. This was no exaggeration, as there were over 10,000 Forrester supporters outside the Opera House brandishing placards with the words, "Working men, shall American or English aristocrats triumph?" They were being led by a man called Ned Buntline, who later found fame as a dime novelist and publicist for Buffalo Bill. He organised a series of running battles with the police after the mob threw stones at the Opera House windows and tried to burn it down. The 7th Regiment of the Army were called out and assembled at Washington Square Park under General Charles Stanford. By 9:15 in the evening, the situation was getting completely out of hand, and the regiment was ordered to the Opera House. The rioters faced 350 militiamen and 100 policemen, in addition to around 100 police in the auditorium. Without warning, the troops lined up and, after firing a warning shot into the air, pointed their guns directly at the crowd and fired. This resulted in 31 people losing their lives and at least 100 injured. The elites were happy that firm action had been taken, but the general public was outraged. A demonstration was called the next day at City Hill Park, in which a young boy lost his life. But at least this time the authorities were able to control the situation, without massacring their own citizens. So, what happened to the main characters? Macready was able to flee to Boston and made his way home, whilst Forrest was involved in a messy divorce, but continued to prosper with his career. Unfortunately, the phonograph was not yet invented, and we will never be able to hear the two thespians' voices. The Bowery Theatre burnt down a couple of times before being demolished in 1929. Regrettably, the Astor Opera House soon acquired the ghoulish nickname of Massacre Opera House. It never recovered its previous standing, and in 1853 all its fixtures and fittings were sold at auction and the building purchased by the Metropolitan Library for $140,000. In 1890, it was demolished and rebuilt. Today it is called Clinton Hall and houses a series of condominiums. The plays of Shakespeare were once seen as a preserve of all classes of society. Everyone could quote large chunks of it. It is now classified as high culture, and for most people, Shakespearian plays are done at school, and then largely forgotten. If you are a man or woman in the street, and asked to quote from any of his plays, you may get "to be or not to be." That is the question, and that is probably your lot. If you're asked the further question of who wrote Coriolanus, King John, or even Richard II, you will be lucky to get the correct answer.